Hello, friends. Welcome to the Piano Maven podcast. My name is Jed Distler, and the Piano Maven is your friendly guide to piano recordings. Last time we were talking about Arthur Rubinstein and his 1964 Moscow recital, which is one of the great piano recitals ever preserved in any form. It's available on video and in audio form. And it got me thinking about what I said about how Arthur Rubinstein tended to be more careful in the recording studio than in his live performances. But I sometimes find that the care and attention to detail that Rubinstein brought to his studio work does benefit certain repertoire, like the Chopin Mazurkas. These are pieces that count among Chopin's most personal as well as most experimental compositions. They run the gamut from earthy elementalism to folk-like simplicity to exquisite harmonic refinement and contrapuntal rigor. And probably more than in any other genre that Chopin composed in, the Mazurkas seem to lend themselves to the widest range of interpretive possibilities. You have, for example, Ignaz Friedman's epic and larger-than-life approach to the Mazurkas. But then you have the total opposite of that from very poetic and intimate Mazurka players like Marilla Jonas. Did I pronounce her name right? Marilla Jonas. Somebody who's going to correct me. Also, Guillermo Novaes is a very intimate Mazurka player in that sense. See, I pronounced her name correctly because I used to speak Portuguese, even though I completely forgot how to speak Portuguese. Now, when Arthur Rubinstein was asked by the HMV label to record all of the Chopin Mazurkas in the late 1930s, at first he wasn't quite sure he wanted to do the project. But once he started reading through the pieces, many of which were not in his repertoire, he eventually acquiesced, and probably because many of these mazurkas were fresh to Rubinstein, were brand new, he plays them with great abandon and rhythmic elan, and sometimes he can be a little cavalier here and there over details, but the sense of spontaneity and exuberance always comes through in these late 1930s mazurka recordings. But then Arthur Rubinstein re-recorded the mazurkas in the early 1950s, and here the piano is more closely mic'd, and the sound lacks some of the roundness of the HMV recordings, which were made in the Abbey Road studio. But the interpretations retain much of the, athleticism of the 78 RPM versions, yet with a little more attention to detail and a little bit more discipline this time. However, when Rubinstein remade, or I guess we say remade the mazurkas for a third time in the mid-1960s in stereo, when he remade these, his approach had become more deliberate, I guess one could say more Germanic, I don't know. But the thoughtfulness that he brings to these later stereo performances are also more precise and thought out in terms of ornamentation, and there's a lot more care in how phrases take shape and move from one to another. But the underlying mazurka rhythm is almost always present, if not quite so robust and extroverted as in the earlier 78 and mono LP cycles. I would say, I guess, that the second Rubinstein cycle, the 1950s mono recordings, maybe they split the difference between the 30s exuberance and the 60s thoughtfulness. Personally, I listen more to the spontaneous 1930s cycle and the more thoughtful 1960s cycle more than I do the 1950s versions. But honestly, all three Arthur Rubinstein Chopin Mazurka cycles are worth hearing. And if I had to make just one choice, though, maybe I'd pick the stereo cycle because you get the combination of Rubinstein's innate feeling for the mazurka idiom and the attention to detail I mentioned earlier, but you also get the ripeness and the maturity that yielded unique insights into certain pieces. And as much as I like the 1930s versions for their spontaneity and effervescence, you do get these qualities with even more fervency and bigness of conception in the mazurkas that Ignaz Friedmann recorded in 1930. He just recorded a handful of mazurkas, but they're absolutely amazing. But that's not to say that Rubinstein in the 1930s in the mazurkas was an inferior product. Far, far, far from that. One of these days, by the way, I want to take each and every mazurka from Rubinstein's 3 cycles and make careful comparisons between the 3 different performances of the same mazurka from each cycle. But, I've been saying that for the last 50 years. And, if my radio show Between the Keys was on 5 days a week, I might consider doing such a comparison on the air. And then I'd invite a panel of listeners to join me and discuss what they hear. But I guess if you did that, you would need about 7 one-hour shows or maybe 8 one-hour-long shows to include enough time for music and talking. And since Between the Keys is on once a week, that would occupy 2 months' worth of programs. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's worth giving 2 months over once a week, listening to and comparing the 3 Rubinstein Chopin Mazurka cycles? I actually posed that question to a very well-known classical radio host, and when he heard my idea of comparing all the Rubinstein Mazurka cycles on many shows, he said, "Jed, you're crazy. Don't waste your time. Rubinstein isn't worth your time." Oh, I was kind of surprised to hear that. Although I have to tell you that I did a program where I compared 22 or so recordings of the finale from Chopin's Funeral March Sonata. There was also a show where we compared 15 recordings of the C major prelude from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. I'm going off way on tangents here. But anyway, we have 3 Arthur Rubinstein Chopin Mazurka cycles. All of them are worth hearing. My first choice is the stereo one from the 60s. My second choice, the version on 78s. Or maybe that's my third choice, and my second choice is the mono LP version from the mid-50s. I really shouldn't be so indecisive. But there are links to all 3 cycles in the show notes, and you can listen and compare for yourself. All I'm asking you to do is enjoy Arthur Rubinstein's Chopin Mazurkas. They are very, very enjoyable. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to the Piano Maven podcast. And please spread the good word about this program, and I will be with you next time. Happy listening.